Hi everybody, welcome to Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Very special guest here, Standard Guthrie, former professional race car driver. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Very nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to have you here in New York.
Pleasure to be here.
So first of all, congratulations on the new documentary, Qualified, coming to ESPN. It must be a pretty interesting time to see your whole life story put together in a film like that.
Indeed, after so many years, I find it quite extraordinary, but the production company did a great job coming up with old footage. Howard Cosell, David Hartman on Good Morning America, all sorts of stuff that I was very surprised to see.
Had you seen all this stuff, or was some of it new for you?
They found some footage that I had never seen before. And in fact, I had forgotten the Howard Cosell interview, but it was a very long time ago.
Well, you have an incredible story, so why don't we go all the way back? Just describe when race car driving became something of interest for you.
Well, let's see. I was born adventurous and grew up insufficiently socialized. So I was flying planes from a very early age, and when I got out of college, I went to work as a research and development engineer for Republic Aviation out Long Island here. And there was no place to go and have fun in airplanes here. Too much traffic, too many traffic control zones. So I bought a Jaguar, a 7-year-old XK120 coupe, and that was the big watershed, the beginning.
So how long did you have that car for?
I had that for about 3 years and discovered sports car racing existed, joined the Sports Car Club of America, got a Roadster that was 500 pounds lighter, and spent 13 years racing sports cars, which is what college-educated people did in those days. They went into the Sports Car Club of America. And at the end of that time, my job in physics had gone down the tubes. I had no money, no insurance, no husband, no jewelry, and no savings. And I was saying, you know, you really must come to your senses. And at that point, I got a call from a guy I never heard of saying, how would you like to take a crack at the Indianapolis 500? And I'm thinking, yeah, right, certainly, another joker.
Right.
But it turned out to be true, and away we went.
That's amazing. So when you ran the Indy 500, what still sticks out in your memory all these years later?
Well, at that time, as many as 85 cars could be entered, and only the fastest 33 would start the race. So back then, the first time you put a car in the field, that is to say you were one of the 33 fastest in qualifying, that's a moment you'll never forget. And then the next year, 78, I formed a team of my own. Meanwhile, I'd also been doing some NASCAR Winston Cup racing. I was also the first woman in the Daytona 500. Yeah. And I was so touched when my NASCAR guys said, you got something together for Indianapolis, you're not going to forget about us, are you? And they did crew my car. So I formed a team of my own with some money I got at the very last minute, and we ended up with a top 10 finish.
Amazing, it really is. How difficult was it to find the crew and find the team? Because you were dealing with a lot of men who didn't want you in the sport. So what was it like doing your own thing and building this whole thing out?
Well, it was a great surprise to me, the commotion it caused at the time. I had no idea there were so many people in the world who believed a woman couldn't do this, that, or the other thing. I got an education.
And you raced with other women, too. It wasn't just men in those early days, right?
In sports car racing, there had always been women. It wasn't a big deal. Yes. And all of a sudden, even though I had driven the Daytona 24-hour International Manufacturers Championship race a couple of times, I'd won my class at the Sebring 12-hour International Manufacturers Championship race a couple of times against some of the top drivers in the world. But that didn't seem to cut any mustard with the round boys. And it was sort of a bell curve from hostility at one end, a lot of skepticism in the middle, and a little open-mindedness at the other end. There were a couple of guys who were very helpful to me at the beginning. Johnny Rutherford in Stalkers, Donnie Allison. But the main thing was skepticism and hostility. But I figured that anything that came with the territory, as long as I got my hands on those cars, I could deal with the rest of it.
Right, you could back it up. Yeah, you could prove them wrong. And so when you did the Daytona 500, I mean, that is such an enormous race. And to have that finish that you did, what do you still remember about that?
Well, I started at the back of the pack because the setup when I qualified had been really terrible. But we got it pretty much fixed at the last minute so the car worked properly. And by the end of the race, I had actually worked my way up to 8th place. But I dropped 2 cylinders for whatever reason, and I lost 4 spots to finish 12th, but I was still top rookie.
Absolutely. Still a great finish. For people that have never done that before, how would you describe the feeling of being behind the wheel at Daytona or at the Indy 500? You're an adventurous person, but that has to be a whole different level.
Indy cars are very precise. They're very tightly bolted together and very taut, and you don't make mistakes for sure. Stalkers, when you're lumbering out to get up on the racetrack, feel like refugees from a junk heap, or they did back then anyway. But if you've got them properly set up, once you're out there running around at 180, 190 miles an hour, the whole thing settles into place, and if you've hit the setup right, it becomes usable.
And the great thing about your story is that you were a skilled driver, but you knew the ins and outs of the cars as well. And I'm sure that there were other men who probably didn't know as much as you did when it comes to the cars. So how critical was it for you to know every little part of that car when you were out there on the racetrack?
It was very helpful, and it was particularly helpful forming a relationship with my crew, because they knew that I knew what they were doing. And every now and then when we had a crisis, I would pick up the wrenches and dive in on an emergency engine change or something like that. So it was really important in forming a relationship with the crew guys.
Definitely. So when you think about the late 70s, I mean, we think about toxic masculinity today and the issues we still have with it, let alone in the 1970s where things were much different. So when you think about your journey, what were the most difficult challenges you faced during that time?
Finding the money to get the equipment, sponsorship. Without a doubt, that was the single most difficult thing. The other stuff I could deal with, but finding the money was tough.
And what were those conversations like when you were trying to get those sponsorships and that money?
Oh, we understand that you've been starting and finishing in the top 10 when a year ago people were saying you couldn't handle one of these cars. And we understand that you can represent your sponsors well, but our budget is just completely committed. That was the only answer you ever got.
And really, if it was just one bold person that would have said, yes, Janet, we're going to back you, that could have been a game changer for you.
If I had had the chance to run a full season with a team, in stock cars, NASCAR Cup racing, I'm sure I would have won races. And I only ever drove 33 races, but I had led a Cup race, I had run with the leaders. Indy cars, I only drove 11 races, and so I can't make that same claim with the same certainty that I would have won IndyCar races, but I think I would have.
Yeah, you had the experience, and you're certainly putting up some great numbers as well at that point. And so you opened the door for others, and obviously Danica Patrick the last few years. I'm sure you look at her situation and you must wonder that if you were in this day and age, how different things would be. So what do you think about that?
It is a different sport nowadays. They're running spec racers now. The cars are all nearly identical, whereas in the 1970s, sometimes at the end of the race, the winner would be the only car on the lead lap. So a lot of things have changed, but women like Sarah Fisher, who qualified on the pole for an IndyCar race, who finished on the podium a couple of times in a very short career because, of course, she too had trouble finding the money. The capable women are out there. It's just a question of who gets the chance.
Right, opportunity. You know,
Indeed.
there's plenty of people that can do this thing, but it's just a matter of pushing these people through. And just breaking the stereotype to say, hey, men and women can both do this together. It's not just a man's sport anymore.
That's the thing about both flying and doing aerobatics and a steerman and the kind of stuff I used to do when I was a kid, and driving race cars. These are 20th century sports. The broad shoulders and the big muscles don't matter. You have this wonderful machinery to do it for you.
Yeah, and mentally, how are you going to get through this race? You know, those are the factors that people should be focusing on.
You're exactly right. It is a matter of spirit and desire and focus. That's what counts.
Definitely. So when you look at the landscape of sport today and you think about where women were during the 70s and 80s, where they are today, are you encouraged by the way things are going? Obviously, more can still be done, but what do you think about the state of women in sports?
Well, of course, Title IX made a huge difference for women in sports that don't cost so much. Before Title IX, there were 0 athletic college scholarships for women, and now there are quite a lot. So Title IX made a huge difference for sports like, everything from golf to basketball. But in the really expensive sports, in motorsports, it's still tougher for a woman, I believe, to find the funding than it is for a man of equivalent experience.
Yeah, because there are certain colleges that may not have those programs, and you have to have, you know, a family that'll support you or friends or something like that. It's much more difficult. But if those opportunities are there, then more women can continue to come through, which would be awesome to see.
What I've always said is that what we need in motorsports is a woman that with all that it takes, the desire, the focus, the talent, plus a fortune of her own.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
Then we'll start seeing a woman in victory circle.
So when you think about your career, it had these great highlights, and then it was a short career because of all the different things that you said. So when you think about when you finally had to say, I'm not getting the support anymore, what was the toughest part to just say, this is not going to happen the way I thought it would?
Well, in 1983, after spending every living moment since 78 trying to find funding to continue, I said, if I keep this up, I'm going to jump out of a high window. So I moved to the mountains of Colorado to work on my book, which was published in 2005. And the publisher went out of business, so I'm looking for a new one.
I think people would be interested in that story, and obviously it starts with the documentary. So when people do check it out, what do you want people to think about your story and your legacy with your career?
Well, in the book, I tried to make sure the reader, even if they knew nothing about the sport, felt what it was like to be inside a driver's skin. I tried to explain the passion and complexity of the sport, and that's what I hope people will remember.
All right, very good. Well, Janet, pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Qualified on ESPN, May 28th. All right, everybody, see you next time here on The Sit Down.